Today, we will be discussing culturally responsive teaching in the context of higher education and whether the perceptions of instructors and their students align. I'm Caiti Griffiths, and my co-authors are Jae-Yoon Han, Gabriela Stakova, and Dr. Ellen Usher. We're from the P20 Motivation and Learning Lab at UK. I'd like to ask you to think about a teacher you had who you really connected with. Maybe it was when you were 10 years old, or maybe it was in college, but at some point, you might have had a teacher who you felt really knew you as a person. How did their behavior communicate that to you? According to Bandura's social cognitive theory, all human behavior is influenced by a combination of personal, behavioral, and environmental factors. One important personal factor is the confidence or self-efficacy that a person has in their ability to do something or behave in a certain way. For example, a teacher might feel high self-efficacy for connecting with their students. This might influence how they behave while teaching, which also shapes the environment that their students learn in. And importantly, all three of these factors also reciprocally influence one another. This means that as teachers shape students' learning environments, students' own perceptions of that teaching sends feedback to their teachers. But there are some disconnects between teachers and students in higher education. In the US, 75% of faculty are white, whereas only about half of their students are white. And in one study of students' perceptions conducted across 5 predominantly white institutions, students felt that white people's interests and viewpoints, including the readings and knowledge shared in their classes, were prioritized above all others. Further, nationwide faculty surveys suggest that faculty are not prepared to address diversity-related conflicts in their classrooms. So one approach that teachers can take to making teaching more relevant to and equitable for historically marginalized students is culturally responsive teaching. In this pedagogy, the content that teachers present and the ways that they behave are shaped through that reciprocal relationship between teachers and students. Culturally responsive teachers teach to and through their students' cultural backgrounds. At the core, culturally responsive teachers are caring, they are willing to challenge racism and discrimination, and they empower students' cultural identities. And research shows that students of culturally responsive teachers are motivated, engaged, enjoy learning more, and can even achieve more. But when it comes to how self-efficacious teachers feel for teaching in a culturally responsive way, not much research has been done on post-secondary instructors. So Wlodkowski's work with pre-service teachers shows that they felt high self-efficacy for caring for students, but less for actually incorporating cultural knowledge. And one study found that college faculty highly valued culturally responsive teaching, but they were less confident in their ability to use the pedagogy. So we wanted to know more about how confident college instructors feel to use culturally responsive teaching. And furthermore, we wanted to get insight on how their students perceive teachers with high self-efficacy for this pedagogy. So our first research question asks about instructors. We wanted to know, how do post-secondary instructors rate their self-efficacy for culturally responsive teaching? Our second research question focuses on students and has 2 parts. First, to what extent are students' perceptions of their instructor's behavior aligned with their instructor's self-perceptions? And second, do these patterns hold when exploring students' responses by race?
In fall 2020, our lab collaborated with the Center for the Enhancement of Learning and Teaching to investigate important factors of teaching and learning during the pandemic. Briefly, we asked about motivational, behavior, and environmental aspects of teaching and learning. We recruited 102 instructors who both took a survey about teaching and learning and distributed a companion survey to their students. In all, more than 6,000 students participated. To measure instructor self-efficacy for culturally responsive teaching, the following items were asked to instructors with a 6-point scale. These items align with Gates' culturally responsive teaching methods and range from challenging prejudice to including cultural diversity in course materials. We conducted an exploratory factor analysis and found that these items represented a unidimensional construct. We also measure students' perception on whether their instructors treat students with respect, cares about students, and the classroom environment itself in terms of sharing diverse perspectives. First of all, we examine the distribution of instructor self-efficacy for culturally responsive teaching. The overall mean was 4.71 out of 6, with 6 representing the highest possible self-efficacy. Among 95 instructors who responded to the corresponding items, 14 instructors reported the highest average scores in self-efficacy for culturally responsive teaching. We decided to focus on these 14 instructors, 71% of whom were white, although we plan to continue exploring less confident instructors in the future. These high self-efficacy instructors had about 400 students participate in the survey, and you will see responses from those students next.
Next, we'll examine students' perceptions. When we asked students how strongly they agree that their instructor treats students with respect, almost 100% of these students agreed to some extent. And when we asked about instructor care, we again found that almost 100% of students agreed to some extent. But we noticed that the third statement, which asked about exposure to diverse opinions and ideas, elicited a wider array of answers than the first two statements. Although a majority of students agreed with the statement to some extent, 12.6% of students disagreed. Next, we wanted to know whether students' answers differed by their race. We examined students in two groups, white students and non-white students. In their perceptions of instructor respect, the total percentage of students who agreed to any extent was about equal across groups. Additionally, non-white students were also the only students who disagreed with the statement in any way, though only 2% of non-white students did. For the instructor care statement, we again saw a similar pattern of agreement. Finally, the statement about exposure to diverse ideas again stood out from instructor respect and care. We found that about twice as many non-white students disagreed to some extent than did white students. 22% of non-white students disagreed in comparison to only 9% of white students.
So this research has shown us that this sample of post-secondary instructors felt highly self-efficacious for culturally responsive teaching. And of the instructors who felt the highest self-efficacy, their students' perceptions seemed to align in terms of respect, care, and being exposed to diverse ideas. However, we didn't ask students about other measures of culturally responsive teaching, such as seeing their own cultures represented in their classes and empowered in their classes. So we can't be sure whether teachers at the college level are teaching both to and through students' cultural backgrounds. Further, these results do indicate some differences between white students' perceptions and non-white students' perceptions, particularly in exposure to diverse ideas. This leads us to how we'd like to expand on this work in the future. First, we'd like to use multi-level modeling to further investigate this relationship on a quantitative level. And further, we know that a limitation of this work is that both samples of instructors and students overrepresented white individuals. So this limitation is one of the reasons that we plan to conduct qualitative interviews with both faculty and students, especially those who come from historically marginalized backgrounds. And we want to work towards a mixed method study. In this way, we hope to gain a fuller picture on how students and teachers perceive culturally responsive teaching at the college level. So thank you so much for listening, and we'd be happy to take any of your questions during the Q&A session.